They marched in with fake badges, thinking they could drag him away in handcuffs. But the moment they touched him, they discovered he was the one who trains the men they fear most. I'll never forget the moment I watched 3 grown men in fake police uniforms try to handcuff my brother Marcus in our front yard, while Kenneth Morrison, our neighborhood's self-appointed HOA dictator, stood behind them with the smuggest grin I'd ever seen. The morning sun cast long shadows across our pristine lawn as Marcus calmly held his hands behind his back, not resisting, but I could see that dangerous stillness in his posture that I recognized from our childhood. Kenneth had no idea he was about to poke a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick. The officers were shouting about trespassing and HOA violations, waving around official-looking documents that I later discovered were printed on Kenneth's home computer. My brother's military training kicked in as he assessed the situation with the cool precision of someone who'd spent the last 8 years turning ordinary soldiers into elite Army Rangers. He didn't raise his voice, didn't struggle, just quietly asked to see their badges and identification numbers. That's when I knew Kenneth Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his pathetic, power-hungry life. The fake cops fumbled with their costumes, clearly not expecting anyone to actually question their authority, while Kenneth's face began to shift from smug satisfaction to nervous uncertainty. Marcus caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod, the same signal he'd used when we were kids, and he was about to turn the tables on the neighborhood bullies. Little did Kenneth know that my brother had spent years dealing with actual criminals, real terrorists, and genuine threats to national security. These amateur-hour intimidation tactics were about to backfire spectacularly. As I watched this pathetic display unfold, I couldn't help but smile because I knew something Kenneth didn't. My brother never loses a fight, especially when someone threatens his family. The morning that started with Kenneth's power play was about to become the beginning of his complete and total downfall. Have you ever dealt with an HOA tyrant who thought they were above the law? Let me know in the comments, because this story is just getting started, and Kenneth Morrison is about to learn why you never mess with a Ranger's family. Kenneth Morrison had transformed our peaceful suburban neighborhood into his personal kingdom over the past 2 years, ruling with an iron fist wrapped in HOA regulations and a superiority complex that would make dictators jealous. This man, who worked as a mid-level insurance adjuster by day, had somehow convinced himself that being elected HOA president gave him the authority of a federal judge, the power of a police chief, and the wisdom of Solomon, all rolled into one insufferable package. His reign of terror began innocently enough with reminders about trash, placement, and lawn maintenance schedules, but quickly escalated into a full-blown surveillance operation where he'd patrol the streets with a clipboard, measuring grass height with a ruler, and photographing any violation he could manufacture. Kenneth had installed security cameras around his own property that conveniently captured footage of his neighbors' yards, which he'd used to send threatening letters about everything from the wrong shade of mailbox paint to children's toys left outside for more than 24 hours. He'd weaponized the HOA's fine system, charging residents hundreds of dollars for infractions so minor that most people didn't even know they were breaking rules, like having a garden hose visible from the street or parking a car in their own driveway for longer than his arbitrarily decided time limit. The man had actually created a 3-ring binder filled with photos, timestamps, and violation reports that he'd present at monthly meetings like he was prosecuting war criminals instead of harassing families trying to live peacefully in their own homes. Kenneth's favorite tactic was targeting new residents and military families, sensing that they might not have the time or energy to fight back against his increasingly ridiculous demands. He'd send certified letters threatening legal action over paint colors that were clearly within HOA guidelines, knowing that most people would simply pay the fine rather than deal with the hassle of fighting him. His psychological warfare included recruiting other residents to spy on their neighbors, offering reduced HOA fees to anyone who reported violations, effectively turning our once friendly community into a network of paranoid informants. When Marcus returned from his latest deployment and moved into the house our grandmother had left us, Kenneth saw fresh meat, a military guy who'd probably be too busy or too respectful of authority to challenge his manufactured supremacy. Little did this petty tyrant know that my brother specialized in dealing with people who abuse power, and Kenneth's amateur hour intimidation tactics were about to meet their match in someone who'd spent years dismantling actual terrorist networks and training soldiers to think strategically under pressure. Kenneth's harassment of Marcus started within a week of his arrival, beginning with a formal letter about the unauthorized military vehicle parked in our driveway, which was actually Marcus's perfectly legal, registered pickup truck that happened to be olive green in color. The complaints escalated to daily inspections of our property, with Kenneth showing up at all hours with his measuring tape and camera, documenting imaginary violations and creating a paper trail of manufactured infractions that he believed would give him leverage over the new military resident who dared to exist in his domain. Marcus, still adjusting to civilian life after 8 years of active duty, tried to handle Kenneth's harassment with the patience and diplomacy that the Army had taught him, even going so far as to invite Kenneth over for coffee to discuss any legitimate concerns about property maintenance or community standards. But Kenneth mistook Marcus's professional courtesy for weakness, interpreting his calm responses and willingness to compromise as signs that he'd found another pushover neighbor who could be bullied into submission through bureaucratic intimidation and legal-sounding threats. The situation reached a boiling point when Kenneth discovered that Marcus had been quietly helping other residents understand their rights under the actual HOA charter, not Kenneth's twisted interpretation of it, and had been advising neighbors on how to properly contest frivolous fines through legitimate legal channels. This act of community service sent Kenneth into a rage, because he realized that his carefully constructed empire of fear was beginning to crumble as residents learned they didn't have to accept his tyrannical overreach without question. Kenneth's biggest mistake came when he decided to escalate beyond harassment and actually break the law, hiring 3 of his unemployed buddies to dress up in fake police uniforms and attempt to arrest Marcus for trespassing on HOA property, which was actually Marcus's own front yard. The fake arrest was Kenneth's nuclear option, designed to humiliate Marcus in front of the entire neighborhood and establish once and for all that Kenneth Morrison was the ultimate authority in this community, with the power to have anyone removed at will. Kenneth had convinced himself that a military guy would automatically comply with anyone wearing a police uniform, not realizing that actual soldiers are trained to verify credentials and question authority when something doesn't smell right. This elaborate charade wasn't just harassment anymore. It was impersonating police officers, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit fraud, federal crimes that would make Kenneth's previous power trips look like playground pranks. As the fake arrest unfolded that morning, Kenneth stood behind his hired actors like a puppet master, finally feeling like he'd achieved the ultimate victory over someone who had dared to challenge his self-proclaimed authority, completely unaware that he'd just committed multiple felonies in front of witnesses and security cameras. What Kenneth didn't realize was that Marcus had been documenting every single interaction, every violation notice, and every instance of harassment from the moment he'd moved into the neighborhood, approaching Kenneth's campaign of intimidation like the intelligence gathering operation it actually was. Marcus's military training had taught him that the best defense against bullies and tyrants is a comprehensive understanding of their methods, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their mistakes. And Kenneth Morrison was making plenty of mistakes that Marcus was quietly cataloging with the precision of someone who'd spent years building cases against actual enemies of the state. While Kenneth was busy playing dress-up dictator, Marcus was conducting surveillance of his own, noting the times Kenneth violated his own HOA rules, photographing his property infractions, and documenting instances where Kenneth had clearly overstepped his legal authority as HOA president. Marcus had also been quietly reaching out to his network of military contacts, including several friends who worked in military police, federal law enforcement, and legal advocacy for veterans, building a support system that Kenneth couldn't even imagine existed. The fake police incident was the final piece of evidence Marcus needed to prove that Kenneth had crossed the line from petty harassment into serious criminal behavior. And Marcus's military training kicked in as he began planning a counter-operation that would neutralize Kenneth's threat permanently and legally. Marcus spent the days following the fake arrest conducting what he called reconnaissance, gathering statements from neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up about Kenneth's abuse of power, collecting evidence of financial irregularities in HOA spending, and building a comprehensive case file that would make prosecutors salivate. His secret weapon wasn't just his military training or his connections in law enforcement. It was his understanding that Kenneth Morrison was a textbook bully who had never actually faced real consequences for his actions, making him predictable, arrogant, and ultimately vulnerable to someone who understood psychological warfare. Marcus began setting traps, allowing Kenneth to believe he was winning while carefully documenting each escalation, each threat, and each violation of federal and state laws that Kenneth committed in his quest to maintain power over the neighborhood. The beauty of Marcus's strategy was that he didn't have to manufacture evidence or create false charges. Kenneth was doing all the work himself, digging his own legal grave with every power-drunk decision he made, while Marcus simply had to be patient and thorough in his documentation. What Kenneth saw as his greatest victory, the fake arrest that he believed would break Marcus's spirit, was actually the moment Marcus realized he had enough evidence to destroy Kenneth's life completely, and the patience and precision that had made him an elite military trainer was about to be turned against a small-town tyrant who had no idea what kind of storm was heading his way. The monthly HOA meeting that Kenneth had been using as his personal throne room for 2 years was about to become the stage for his complete and utter humiliation. Though he walked into that community center conference room with the same arrogant confidence that had carried him through months of terrorizing his neighbors. Kenneth had called this particular meeting to address what he termed ongoing security concerns in the neighborhood, planning to use Marcus's alleged trespassing incident as justification for hiring private security and implementing even stricter community surveillance measures. Marcus arrived early, dressed in his crisp army dress uniform with all his ribbons and commendations clearly displayed, accompanied by 2 gentlemen in dark suits, who Kenneth assumed were Marcus's lawyers, though their actual identities would soon become Kenneth's worst nightmare. As residents filed into the room, Marcus quietly distributed folders to each household representative, explaining that he had some important information to share about recent security concerns in the neighborhood, his calm demeanor giving no hint of the bombshell he was about to drop on Kenneth's carefully constructed empire. Kenneth opened the meeting with his usual pompous speech about community standards and the importance of respecting HOA authority, but his confidence began to waver when he noticed the folders Marcus had distributed and the serious expressions on his neighbors' faces as they reviewed the contents. When Kenneth called for old business, Marcus stood up and politely requested permission to address the community about recent criminal activity that has been taking place in our neighborhood, his military bearing commanding immediate attention and respect from everyone except Kenneth, who was beginning to sweat despite the air conditioning. Marcus began his presentation by introducing his companions, Special Agent Rodriguez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division and Detective Sullivan from the County Sheriff's Department, and explained that they were investigating reports of fraud, impersonation of law enforcement officers, and conspiracy charges related to recent incidents in the community. The room fell silent as Marcus methodically presented evidence of Kenneth's crimes, starting with financial records showing how Kenneth had been embezzling HOA funds through fake vendor contracts and inflated maintenance charges, stealing thousands of dollars from his neighbors under the guise of community improvements. Kenneth's face went white as Marcus displayed photographs showing Kenneth's violation of his own HOA rules, the unpermitted deck extension, the commercial vehicle parked overnight in his driveway, the fence that exceeded height regulations, accompanied by timestamps proving that Kenneth had been selectively enforcing rules based on personal vendettas rather than community standards. The coup de grace came when Marcus played security footage from multiple sources showing Kenneth coordinating the fake arrest, including audio of Kenneth instructing his accomplices on what charges to fabricate and how to make the arrest look official enough to intimidate other residents into compliance. Kenneth's world collapsed in real time as Special Agent Rodriguez stood up and formally placed him under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, conspiracy, and theft, reading him his rights while the entire community watched the man who had terrorized them for years reduced to a stammering, sweating mess begging for mercy he had never shown others. The fake police officers Kenneth had hired were arrested simultaneously at their homes, charged as co-conspirators in a federal crime that carried serious prison time, their amateur criminal enterprise unraveled by someone who actually understood how law enforcement investigations worked. Detective Sullivan announced that the county prosecutor would be filing additional charges related to Kenneth's abuse of his position as HOA president, including breach of fiduciary duty and elder abuse, since several of Kenneth's victims had been senior citizens on fixed incomes who couldn't afford to fight his fraudulent fines. As Kenneth was led away in handcuffs, Marcus calmly explained to the stunned residents that the investigation had uncovered evidence of Kenneth's crimes dating back to the beginning of his tenure as HOA president, including forged signatures on HOA documents and unauthorized changes to community bylaws that Kenneth had made to increase his own power. The financial audit that followed Kenneth's arrest revealed that he had stolen over $40,000 from the community through various schemes, money that had been earmarked for playground improvements, street repairs, and emergency reserves that Kenneth had redirected into his personal accounts. Kenneth's house, the showcase property he had used to justify his rigid enforcement of community standards, was seized as evidence in the fraud case, since it had been renovated using stolen HOA funds, and federal marshals placed foreclosure notices on his front door within a week of his arrest. The irony was perfect. Kenneth Morrison, who had spent 2 years threatening other residents with legal action and eviction, lost his own home to actual law enforcement officers conducting a legitimate investigation into his crimes. Marcus's patient documentation had provided prosecutors with such overwhelming evidence that Kenneth's high-priced attorney advised him to accept a plea deal rather than face trial, knowing that a jury would have no sympathy for someone who had abused his authority to steal from his neighbors and terrorize families. Kenneth's mugshot appeared in the local newspaper alongside stories about his fraud conviction, ensuring that his reputation was destroyed not just in the neighborhood, but throughout the entire community, making him unemployable and unwelcome wherever he tried to rebuild his life. The man who had once ruled the neighborhood like a petty dictator was now facing 5 years in federal prison, financial ruin, and the knowledge that his victims were finally free to live in peace while he paid the price for his crimes behind bars. With Kenneth Morrison behind bars and his reign of terror officially ended, the neighborhood began the healing process of rebuilding the sense of community that his toxic leadership had nearly destroyed, starting with an emergency HOA meeting where residents voted unanimously to dissolve the existing board and implement new bylaws that would prevent any future president from accumulating the unchecked power that Kenneth had abused. Marcus was unanimously elected as the interim HOA president, not because he sought the position, but because his neighbors trusted his integrity and his proven ability to stand up to bullies and corruption, qualities that had been sorely missing during Kenneth's dictatorship. Under Marcus's leadership, the community established new transparency requirements for all HOA decisions, including mandatory financial audits, term limits for board members, and a grievance process that protected residents from frivolous fines and arbitrary enforcement of rules. The money recovered from Kenneth's fraud conviction was returned to the community and used for the improvements Kenneth had promised but never delivered: new playground equipment, street repairs, and a community garden that brought neighbors together instead of driving them apart through fear and suspicion. Marcus implemented what he called common sense governance, focusing on genuine safety and property value protection while eliminating the petty harassment and manufactured violations that had made living in the neighborhood a constant source of stress and anxiety. The fake police incident became a teaching moment for the entire community, with Marcus organizing a presentation by real law enforcement officers who explained residents' rights during police encounters and how to verify the authenticity of anyone claiming to have legal authority. Children began playing in yards again without fear of generating violation notices. Neighbors resumed friendly conversations over property lines, and the atmosphere of paranoia and surveillance that Kenneth had cultivated was replaced by the mutual respect and cooperation that makes communities thrive. Marcus's military experience proved invaluable in organizing community events and emergency preparedness initiatives that actually served residents' needs rather than feeding someone's power fantasies, showing everyone what real leadership looked like after years of Kenneth's authoritarian theatrics. The neighborhood property values increased significantly once word spread that the community had successfully removed a corrupt HOA president and established new governance that protected residents rather than terrorizing them, attracting new families who wanted to live somewhere with strong community values and effective leadership. 6 months after Kenneth's conviction, Marcus received a letter from Kenneth in prison, a rambling apology that tried to justify his actions while begging for Marcus's forgiveness and asking for help with his legal appeals, a request that Marcus ignored because some lessons can only be learned through experiencing the full consequences of one's actions. The community center where Kenneth had once held court as a petty tyrant was renamed the Community Freedom Center in honor of their liberation from his rule, and Marcus made sure that the story of Kenneth's downfall was preserved as a reminder that no one, regardless of their position, is above the law or immune to justice when they abuse their power. Marcus returned to his quiet life as a civilian and part-time military instructor, having successfully completed his most important mission, protecting his community from a domestic threat that had been terrorizing families and corrupting the principles of democratic governance that he had spent 8 years defending overseas. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Kenneth Morrison, who had played soldier with his fake police uniforms and military-style tactics, had been taken down by a real soldier who understood the difference between legitimate authority and criminal abuse of power. Marcus's front yard, where Kenneth's fake arrest had taken place, became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and a reminder that bullies eventually face consequences when they target the wrong person. And Marcus maintained it with the same pride he had once taken in representing his country in uniform. The neighborhood kids, who had grown up afraid to leave toys in their yards or ride bicycles on the sidewalks during Kenneth's reign, now gathered regularly in Marcus's yard for impromptu football games and military stories, learning valuable lessons about courage, integrity, and standing up to bullies. Marcus never spoke publicly about his role in Kenneth's downfall, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves and focusing on the future rather than dwelling on the satisfaction of watching a tyrant fall, though his neighbors made sure that the story spread throughout the wider community as both entertainment and education. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story 6 months later, interviewing residents about life after Kenneth and highlighting how the community had transformed from a surveillance state into a model neighborhood where families felt safe and HOA meetings were actually productive rather than exercises in intimidation. Kenneth Morrison's name became synonymous with HOA corruption in the region, used as a cautionary tale in local government training sessions and community organization workshops about the importance of checks and balances in neighborhood governance. Marcus occasionally received calls from other military families dealing with similar HOA harassment, and he always took time to share his experience and provide guidance on how to document abuse and seek proper legal recourse, turning his victory over Kenneth into ongoing service to the veteran community. The house that Kenneth had lost to federal seizure was eventually sold to a young military family, and Marcus made sure they were welcomed properly to the neighborhood with a community barbecue rather than harassment letters, showing them what military camaraderie looked like in civilian life. 2 years after Kenneth's conviction, Marcus received his promotion to Master Sergeant and a new assignment training Rangers at Fort Benning. But his neighbors convinced him to keep the house as a permanent residence and base of operations for his new role in ensuring that their community remained free from future tyrants. The final irony came when Marcus learned that Kenneth had been denied parole twice due to his continued belief that he had done nothing wrong and his threats to reclaim his rightful position. When released, proving that some people never learn from their mistakes and ensuring that the community remained protected from his return. As Marcus sat on his front porch on quiet evenings, watching families enjoy the peace and freedom that had been restored to their neighborhood, he reflected on the fact that his most important victory hadn't come on a foreign battlefield, but in defending the American dream of safe, prosperous communities where families can thrive without fear of petty dictators and homegrown tyrants. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare that needed military precision to solve? Share your story in the comments. And subscribe for more incredible tales of justice served and bullies defeated. The FBI investigation that began with Kenneth Morrison's amateur criminal enterprise soon revealed a much larger conspiracy that stretched beyond our small neighborhood, as Special Agent Rodriguez discovered that Kenneth had been part of an underground network of corrupt HOA presidents who shared tactics, resources, and even fake legal documents through encrypted online forums. Marcus found himself working closely with federal investigators as they uncovered evidence that Kenneth had been selling his enforcement strategies to other HOA tyrants across 3 states, teaching them how to manufacture violations, intimidate residents, and embezzle community funds without getting caught. The investigation revealed that Kenneth's fake police uniforms weren't a one-time purchase, but part of a bulk order that had been distributed to at least 12 other HOA presidents who had been using the same intimidation tactics against military families, senior citizens, and anyone else they perceived as vulnerable targets. Marcus's documentation became the foundation for a federal task force that began investigating what prosecutors dubbed the HOA Mafia, a criminal organization that had been operating under the cover of legitimate community governance while systematically defrauding homeowners and violating civil rights across multiple jurisdictions. Detective Sullivan's investigation into Kenneth's local crimes expanded when residents from neighboring communities began coming forward with similar stories of harassment, fake legal threats, and financial fraud perpetrated by HOA boards that had clearly learned their tactics from Kenneth's playbook. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when investigators discovered that Kenneth had been running weekend seminars at local hotels, teaching other HOA board members how to maximize fine revenue, eliminate opposition through intimidation, and use legal-sounding language to threaten residents who couldn't afford to hire attorneys to fight back. Marcus testified before a federal grand jury about his experiences with Kenneth's harassment campaign, providing crucial insider knowledge about military families and veteran communities that helped prosecutors understand how these criminals had been specifically targeting service members who were frequently deployed and couldn't immediately respond to fraudulent legal threats. The investigation revealed that Kenneth's network had stolen over $2 million from homeowners across the region, money that had been laundered through fake maintenance contracts, inflated legal fees, and phantom security services that never actually existed. As more victims came forward, Marcus found himself becoming an unofficial advocate for military families who had been targeted by corrupt HOA boards, using his military connections and legal knowledge to help other veterans fight back against similar harassment campaigns. The federal task force discovered that Kenneth's group had been maintaining detailed databases of potential targets, including information about deployment schedules, family situations, and financial vulnerabilities that they used to time their harassment campaigns for maximum effectiveness. Kenneth's arrest had triggered a domino effect that was bringing down an entire criminal enterprise, and Marcus realized that his decision to fight back hadn't just saved his own neighborhood, but it potentially helped hundreds of other families who were suffering under similar tyrannical regimes. Kenneth Morrison's federal trial became a media sensation when local news outlets realized that the case involved fake police officers, stolen community funds, and a decorated Army Ranger who had single-handedly brought down a multi-state criminal conspiracy that had been terrorizing homeowners for years. Marcus took the witness stand wearing his dress uniform, his chest full of ribbons and commendations providing a stark contrast to Kenneth, who sat at the defense table looking like the small, pathetic man he had always been beneath his manufactured authority and borrowed power. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that Kenneth's expensive attorney spent most of his time trying to negotiate a plea deal rather than attempting to defend actions that had been thoroughly documented through Marcus's meticulous evidence gathering and the FBI's comprehensive investigation. Marcus's testimony was devastating as he calmly recounted Kenneth's escalating harassment campaign, the fake arrest attempt, and the systematic abuse of power that had terrorized not just military families, but elderly residents, single mothers, and anyone else Kenneth perceived as unable to fight back against his manufactured authority. The courtroom gallery was packed with Kenneth's victims, neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up during his reign of terror, but who now felt empowered to tell their stories of harassment, financial fraud, and psychological manipulation at the hands of someone who had twisted community governance into a personal profit center. Kenneth's co-conspirators testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences, revealing the inner workings of their criminal network and describing how Kenneth had been a mastermind who developed many of the tactics they had used to defraud homeowners across multiple states. The judge, a veteran himself, showed visible anger when reviewing evidence of how Kenneth's network had specifically targeted military families, calling their tactics un-American and a disgrace to the principles of community service and democratic governance. Marcus remained composed throughout cross-examination, his military training evident as he methodically destroyed the defense's attempts to portray Kenneth as an overzealous volunteer rather than a calculating criminal who had systematically abused his position for personal gain. The prosecution played audio recordings of Kenneth bragging to his co-conspirators about his ability to break resistant homeowners through psychological warfare and legal intimidation, recordings that Marcus's patience and strategic thinking had made possible by allowing Kenneth to incriminate himself. Kenneth's attempt to represent himself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach fell flat when Marcus presented evidence showing how Kenneth had celebrated each successful harassment campaign and had actively recruited other HOA presidents to join his criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and Kenneth's face crumbled as he realized that his years of terrorizing innocent families had finally caught up with him in the form of a federal conviction that would follow him for the rest of his life. Kenneth Morrison's conviction and the exposure of his criminal network triggered a nationwide examination of HOA governance that led to legislative reforms in over 20 states, with Marcus serving as a consultant to lawmakers who were drafting new regulations designed to prevent future abuse of homeowner association authority. Marcus found himself testifying before state legislatures about the specific tactics used by corrupt HOA boards, helping lawmakers understand how legitimate community governance could be weaponized by criminals who understood that most homeowners lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back against fraudulent legal threats. The Morrison case, as it became known in legal circles, was cited in dozens of lawsuits filed by homeowners against abusive HOA boards, with Marcus's documentation methods becoming a template for residents who needed to build cases against corrupt community leaders. Veterans advocacy organizations began using Marcus's story as a training example, teaching military families how to recognize and document HOA harassment before it escalated to the criminal level, and providing resources for service members who found themselves targeted by corrupt board members. The real estate industry was forced to acknowledge that HOA corruption was a serious problem that affected property values and community stability, leading to new disclosure requirements for homes sold in communities with histories of board misconduct or financial irregularities. Marcus received commendations from several veterans organizations for his service to military families, but he remained focused on practical solutions rather than recognition, working with legal aid organizations to develop resources that could help homeowners fight back against HOA abuse without needing expensive attorneys. The investigation's revelations about how corrupt HOA boards have been specifically targeting vulnerable populations led to federal civil rights investigations in several states, with prosecutors treating systematic harassment of protected classes as the hate crimes they actually were. Kenneth's network had been so extensive that its dismantling created a power vacuum in corrupt HOA governance that was filled by legitimate community leaders who actually wanted to serve their neighbors rather than exploit them for personal gain. Marcus's neighborhood became a model for reformed HOA governance, with their new bylaws and transparency requirements being adopted by communities across the country that wanted to prevent future Kenneth Morrisons from gaining power over their residents. The media attention surrounding the case led to a documentary film about HOA corruption that featured Marcus's story prominently, though he donated his appearance fees to organizations that provided legal assistance to homeowners fighting abusive community associations. Law enforcement agencies began training officers to recognize the warning signs of HOA-related fraud and abuse, using Kenneth's case as an example of how community leadership positions could be exploited by criminals who understood that their victims were often isolated and uninformed about their legal rights. The long-term impact of Marcus's decision to fight back extended far beyond his own neighborhood. creating a ripple effect that protected thousands of families from similar harassment and establishing new legal precedents that made it much harder for future tyrants to abuse HOA authority without facing serious consequences. 5 years after Kenneth Morrison's conviction, Marcus had transformed his personal victory into a nationwide movement that protected homeowners from HOA tyranny, establishing the Ranger Foundation for Community Justice that provided free legal assistance, documentation training, and strategic support to families facing corrupt homeowner association boards across the country. What started as one soldier defending his neighborhood had evolved into a comprehensive network of volunteers, many of them veterans, who used military precision and tactical thinking to investigate HOA corruption and build bulletproof cases against criminals who hid behind legitimate community governance. Marcus's foundation had successfully prosecuted over 200 corrupt HOA board members in 35 states, recovering millions of dollars in stolen funds and freeing thousands of families from the psychological terrorism that had once made Kenneth Morrison feel so powerful and untouchable in his small suburban kingdom. The Foundation's Operation Homestead program trained military spouses and veteran families to recognize the early warning signs of HOA corruption, providing them with documentation templates, legal resources, and a 24-hour hotline staffed by volunteers who understood both military culture and community law. Marcus had personally testified in congressional hearings about the need for federal oversight of homeowner associations, arguing that communities receiving any form of government funding or tax benefits should be required to meet basic standards of transparency, accountability, and due process that would prevent future Kenneth Morrisons from terrorizing their neighbors. The Foundation's most successful innovation was the Digital Accountability Project, which used social media, online databases, and crowdsourced documentation to track corrupt HOA board members across multiple states, making it impossible for them to simply move to new communities and resume their criminal activities under different names. Marcus's military network had proven invaluable in building the Foundation's investigative capabilities, with retired intelligence officers, military police, and Judge Advocate General Corps veterans volunteering their expertise to help homeowners build cases that would hold up in federal court. The Foundation had also established partnerships with major real estate companies, requiring them to disclose HOA corruption histories and providing buyers with tools to research community governance before purchasing homes in potentially problematic developments. Kenneth Morrison himself had become an unwitting poster child for HOA reform, with his mugshot and conviction details displayed prominently on the Foundation's website as a warning to other would-be tyrants about the consequences of abusing community leadership positions. Marcus's story had inspired similar foundations in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where homeowner association corruption had become a growing problem that required the same systematic, military-style approach that had proven so effective against Kenneth's criminal network. The Foundation's annual conference, held in Marcus's hometown, brought together hundreds of volunteers, legal experts, and HOA reform advocates who shared strategies, celebrated victories, and planned new initiatives to protect homeowners from the kind of systematic abuse that had once made Kenneth Morrison believe he was untouchable. Marcus often reflected on how Kenneth's decision to target a military family had ultimately led to the protection of thousands of other families, proving that bullies who pick the wrong targets don't just face personal consequences. They sometimes trigger movements that ensure their victims never have to suffer alone again. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and the powerful dignity of military service. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of respecting others and to inspire a deeper appreciation for those who serve and protect our country.